Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Before the curtain rises on our episode today, a brief reminder, if I may, about becoming a patron of the Play Podcast. For the price of an ice cream or two at the interval, you can not only help me to continue to make the podcast, but patrons can also hear or read additional content about the plays that we cover, as well as have early access to the Play Review, our sister podcast where Jody Rylett and I share reviews of some current productions on the London stage. Our two newest patrons are Milovan Marasovic and Chris Messina. Welcome and thank you both. For more information on becoming a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. Many thanks. And now, on with today's episode. Hello, and welcome to episode 90 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on a luxuriously and artistically furnished room in a gentleman's flat just off Piccadilly in London. The sound of a piano is heard. A manservant is arranging afternoon tea on the table, complete with cucumber sandwiches. After the music ceases, a young man enters. He is Algernon Moncrief, and he is expecting his aunt, Lady Bracknell, for tea. However, his friend, Earnest Worthing, arrives unexpectedly, having traveled up from his country residence to amuse himself in town, something that he and Algernon not infrequently do together. On this occasion, however, he has come with the specific purpose of asking Lady Bracknell's daughter, Gwendolen, to marry him. But Algernon has stumbled upon an impediment to Ernest's plans, a secret about his identity that will lead both men to perpetrate further deceptions in pursuit of love. This is Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, possibly the most famous romantic comedy in theatrical history. The play is renowned for its effervescent portrait of aristocratic amusement and its impossibly clever wit, including some of the most quotable lines in dramatic literature. But it is also an anarchic parody of social custom and pretension, written just months before the scandal and trials that would destroy Wilde's reputation and life. It was first performed at the St. James's Theatre in London in February 1895, and Wilde himself said of the play, with characteristic modesty, "The first act is ingenious, the second beautiful, the third abominably clever." This is our first Wilde play on the podcast, and we start with his last and greatest. I must confess that I wasn't sure how well Wilde's masterpiece of artifice would stand up to contemporary scrutiny, but any fear that it would now come across only as an overly precious and dated drawing-room farce was dispelled by the exuberant new production that is currently running at the National Theatre in London. Its ravishing visual design, its self-conscious knowingness, its championing of uninhibited aesthetic values, and the frank forefronting of the play's sexual resonances, all these make this a modern rendition that I can't help but think that Wilde himself would have loved. So I'm hugely fortunate and delighted to be joined today by the production's director, Max Webster. Max is a prolific director whose recent work includes his acclaimed production of Macbeth with David Tennant and Cush Jumbo at the Donmar Warehouse, and which just concluded its run in the West End this past week. He also directed this autumn's revival of The Real Thing at the Old Vic, which inspired our recent episode on the play. And other recent credits include Henry V at the Donmar, where he has been an associate director for the past 4 years, and the extraordinary staging of Life of Pi, for which Max was nominated for Olivier and Tony Awards for Best Director. Welcome to the Play Podcast, Max. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
My first question is, do you remember when you first came across this play and what attracted you to want to direct it now? I wonder if you feared if you could make it afresh, as I may have suggested.
So I read the play as a kid. My dad was in an amateur production of it
Ah, great.
in Bury St Edmunds in the 70s. And we had in our house as I was growing up a fabulous photo of him in these massive purple bell-bottom flares with long curly locks on his shoulder as a 21-year-old kind of student actor doing the play. And he would regale us with stories of it. So I think we had a very old copy of it from the 60s or something, which is a little paperback. And I read that as a teenager and really liked it. I liked the wit, I liked the surprise of it, the artifice of it. And I suppose in a way, I sort of understood that Wilde was representing some sort of freedom, although probably 12 or 13-year-old Mac, whenever I was reading it, didn't quite understand what that kind of bid for freedom was at that time.
So you had some understanding of it as a teenager. So what brought you to thinking, oh, I could do it now?
Well, I've always tried to turn it around in my head as a sort of Rubik's Cube, as can you make the play do something slightly different from what you expect it to do? So I've seen a couple of really good traditional productions, and they're reliably funny and they're reliably clever. But it feels that something about Oscar Wilde's enterprise as a writer was subversive, or it was kicking against the norms of Victorian society. So Oscar Wilde is not as posh as the characters he's writing. He's Irish, so he's an outsider in London, and he's coming to see all the kind of English social rules as constrictive and in some ways essentially arbitrary. And of course, he's a what we'd now call gay or queer man who is being forced to live in a heteronormative Victorian society and can't talk about his inner life, his private life publicly. And indeed, the moment when he starts to do so is the moment when he gets arrested. And so there is a kind of critique in Oscar Wilde's work of those Victorian rules and a critique of kind of the fuddy-duddiness of Victorian art. And I guess a sort of we can talk more about this, a kind of liberatory enterprise, a kind of thought that actually through art and through fiction, through storytelling, you can kind of be and become the person you dream of being or want to be, which I think is what I sort of came to understand as the deep gambit behind the importance of being earnest. But for a long time, I was quite confused what to do with it because I knew what the stuffy Victorian drawing room production of it was, and I didn't know how you could lightly modernize it without breaking it. And so between the period when Rufus Norris, who's the artistic director of the National Theatre, said, do you want to do this? And the moment we started rehearsals was a lot of kind of trying to turn it around in my head and see how bold could you be, especially around gay and queer subtexts in the play, without making the main mechanism of the plot fall apart and no longer make sense.
Yeah, I mean, so many good points in there. And I love the fact that you say that it represents freedom in all sorts of ways about where it comes from in Wilde's life as well. Can you tell us, in fact, a bit more about where it comes from in his life and career? Because it was quite a tumultuous time in his life when he wrote it and then when it came to the stage, wasn't it?
Yes, so Oscar Wilde had been established as a successful playwright. So Lady Windermere's Fan, A Woman of No Importance, had been successful plays and were making him, for the first time in his life, real money. And so he was doing well. And he'd got a kind of level of acceptance in polite Victorian society that literary success and scandal, but the literary success was bringing him. And I guess a couple of years before he wrote The Importance of Being Earnest and before he wrote his other masterpiece, The Picture of Dorian Gray, he started regularly having sex with guys. I mean, presumably that's something he'd thought about all his life, but that he hadn't been able to act on it regularly until recently. And so there's something really interesting about the activation of his sexuality in his private life, and then suddenly the kind of artistic and financial flowering that comes with that discovery of freedom. And so The Importance of Being Earnest happens at exactly the fulcrum in his life of how brave and how bold can he be about what he's able to say and do about his sexuality in his private life before he gets into trouble with the law. And the famous story is that on the opening night of The Importance of Being Earnest, Bosie, who was his boyfriend, Bosie's father was the Marquis of Queensberry, who invented the Queensberry boxing rules and was very, very unhappy that his son Bosie was in a relationship of sorts with Wilde. And so he stormed around the theatre trying to get in and make a scandal. He hired Boxer to support him, as sort of extra muscle to, I don't know what, intimidate him or worse, perhaps. And then in the end, when they wouldn't let him in, went to Covent Garden and bought a bouquet of rotting vegetables and left them at stage door with a card for Oscar saying, you're a posing somdomite, which is a misspelt word of the slur sodomite. And that's what led to the libel case. And so Oscar Wilde, either in an act of foolishness or an act of great courage and bravery, depending on how you want to view the story, sued him for libel. And that led to the countersuing, which ended up him in Reading jail. So in a way, impossibly Earnest, which in one sense seems like the most trivial comedy, almost like a play about kind of nothing, like a hot air balloon that just sort of rises and rises and rises with nothing in its centre, is also the work in which he is almost the closest to speaking his personal truth, and at that absolute cusp of how far can Oscar push it before he gets arrested, before he gets put away. And so it's also the idea of the play as the kind of airy nothing, the souffle version of the play is the version I've been brought up doing and seeing, but the version of the play that's still fun and silly and got lots of jokes in. I don't mean it suddenly becomes a heavy evening, but the version of the play, it's also about how far can you push these conversations in Victorian England before you get put in Reading jail. That wasn't a version of the play I'd seen. So that was what I was interested in exploring.
Yes, and the production balances that beautifully because there is still, I think, faithfulness to the original text.
Yes.
But also this contemporary lens to some degree, or that at least releases some of this subtext that's there in the play. Because, as you say, in the main, we assume it's a concoction, something frivolous, but there is much more going on there. But you're right, the irony of the timing is just terrible. What happens to Wilde is tragic. It's fascinating you point to the idea that there's this coincidence of his sense of freedom and his artistic output, because he was incredibly prolific in the early 1890s, but the clouds were gathering. I mean, there was a lot of gossip about the scandalous life he was leading in the couple of years leading up to when the play was actually done in early 1895. One can now, I guess, with hindsight, think that some of this might have been foreshadowing of what was coming to him.
Yes.
And whether he was risking putting stuff out there in this regard. But it is also, on the other hand, it's hard to imagine that he really imagined it was as dangerous as it turned out to be, of course.
Well, I think Oscar's way of dealing with these things is wit. So the wit, weirdly, is a Trojan horse for saying the unsayable. So if you can say something charmingly enough or funnily enough, you can kind of get away with saying anything. At least that's what he thought. And eventually he reached the limit of what that is. So in his first trial, the prosecutor said to him, "Did you kiss this young man? Did you have sexual relations with this person?" And his answer wasn't, "Oh, no, I don't have sexual relations with men." His answer was, "Oh, no, he wasn't nearly good looking enough." And that sort of everyone laughed, and that seemed to be okay. And no one was terribly bothered by that answer. And because it was said daringly and bravely, and it clearly got a laugh in that moment, the kind of wit became a way of saying the unsayable, and the humour was a form of defence in a way.
And that happens in the play, too. The wit is saying things that are more serious than they would suggest. And you're right. I mean, I actually came across some of the transcript of the trial, and it is an extraordinary performance Wilde's putting on the witness stand. Just astounding how witty, as you say, he is, and how brave he is in behaving in that way. It is wondrous, actually. It could come right out of his writings. It's beautifully delivered, and as you say, funny, but of course, it's in the wrong context ultimately, and he can't evade it. And of course, as you said earlier, it's somewhat self-inflicted, but it's one where he was persecuted by a society that could not accommodate who he was. And it had a real impact on the play. The play opened to acclaim just a few weeks before the trial started. But then when the trials were going on, the box office receipts fell, and the producer tried to save the production by removing Wilde's name from the playbills, but it still closed after only 80 performances. And indeed, Wilde's name was not featured on posters and programs on revivals for the play for some time afterwards. So yeah, his reputation, but also his spirit and his health were destroyed by all that happened to him. It was interesting that at some point during that period where he was writing so much and wrote this play, he said something about work never seemed to him a reality, but a way of getting rid of reality. So somehow he was escaping, I suppose, what was going on in his life. And perhaps the play actually presents a positive spin on his lifestyle and the way it could be, or he hoped it could be sustained. But sadly, reality could not be evaded forever.
Yes, it's a play in which all the young people manage to evade reality through fiction. So Jack says at the beginning of the play, "I've got a brother, and my name's Earnest." And they're lies at the beginning of the play, they're fictions. And by the end of the play, they turn out to be true. His fiction comes to life, as it were. Or Cecily starts writing these letters from this person she's never met, who's going to whisk her off her feet. And then suddenly, like, her imaginary friend appears in her garden. And so the fiction that she's writing becomes true, and that becomes her life. And so I guess that's what I mean by emancipatory in the play, which is that I think the play is suggesting that if you can tell the story of your life in a creative enough way, you can sort of manifest that way into being. And of course, that isn't totally possible if you're a 19th century gay man, but that wish or that dream or that fantasy is very freeing, I think.
Yes, I mean, he actually expressed it seriously, didn't he, in talking about life imitating art and that sort of thing. And in a way, I guess he was trying to live his own life in this artful way. And the play is a representation of that. But as you say, the plot and the structure of the play is beautifully constructed. Everything means the opposite.
Yes.
The men are pretending to be someone else, but they turn out to be true, the things that they've been saying. But also, it's completely absurd what goes on in this plot.
Yes, totally. Totally absurd.
None of it is credible, and yet we somehow buy it and just float through it. Starting with the fact that the women insist that they can only love and marry someone named Earnest. I mean, that's just ludicrous, of course.
Yes. I mean, there's a good argument Oscar Wilde is the father of the 20th century, culturally in some ways, and that you can see both branches of political activism and socialism coming off his work. But you can also see branches of surrealism and absurdism coming off it. So, like, the theatre of Beckett and Ionesco isn't really possible without Wilde, I think. It's that weird end of the 19th century bridge point in which, and you can see it happening in Wilde's work. So, like, A Woman of No Importance or An Ideal Husband are much more traditional Victorian melodramas in that they take the story of the fallen woman and satirize it and twist it and complicate it so that you go, actually, maybe it's the patriarchy that's at fault rather than the fallen woman. So it is already, you can see that's more like taking the Victorian form and giving it a social meaning. But I guess what he does with What's Being Earnest is he takes a traditional form of the farce and he takes the ground away from under it, so it becomes lighter and weirder and harder to get to deep meaning. And that kind of gesture is, I think, at the heart of the absurdist theatre of the 20th century as well. And I'm sure Wilde has a huge influence on that.
Yeah, it's fascinating you say Beckett. Actually, our very last episode was Waiting for Godot, and incidentally discovered that Beckett went to the same school Wilde did.
One of the things that makes me really happy in our show is, for various practical reasons, we staged the muffin scene in front of a red curtain so that we can do the change from Act 3 to Act 4 live without a second interval. And it makes that little scene, which I love and is so beautifully performed by Shruti Gatwar and Hugh Skinner, but it kind of reminds me of Beckett because they even make a joke about waiting for the scene change to go. And it suddenly becomes not only part of the story, but it becomes also a scene about waiting and sort of not really about anything in particular other than two people filling time with their own company and with language. And suddenly in my heart, in my head, we're kind of in Beckett land, albeit with a red curtain and beautiful white suits.
I absolutely love that scene. It's so delicious. And actually, I don't know whether this was ad lib or not. It probably was. But on the day I saw it, Max, Hugh was speaking while he was eating muffins. And he turned to Shruti and he said, "Sorry, I just spat on you."
No, that's not scripted. I didn't see that show.
So then this brought the house down because they corpsed for a bit at this point, and we were all thinking this is brilliant. And then just moments later, he's chewing away on the muffin, and Hugh is waiting for him. His cue is overdue, and he says, "Sorry, I was just chewing properly there." It was just brilliant stuff. Anyway, we diverge. But the other thing that it suggested to me, again, I thought this earlier today, I thought, no, this is too outlandish. The connection with Godot, which was that Algernon and Jack seem like a bit of a comic double act.
Yes.
As Vladimir and Estragon are in Godot, with Jack perhaps being the straight man to Algy's constant nonsense, as he puts it. Does that make sense?
It does. There's a vaudeville tradition that Wilde had seen both in the UK and in America, and that gives a certain kind of rhythm to the dialogues that he's got. And that's definitely in some of that sort of double act rhythm.
Okay. Well, yeah, when we talked about the absurdity, the improbability of the whole plot is crazy. And I'm saying about it hinging on marrying the man named Earnest. We got the improbable moment of distraction in which Miss Prism puts a baby into a handbag and her novel into the pram. And the romantic plot is absurd. Algernon literally falls in love and proposes to Cecily within an hour of meeting her. But we sail straight through that as well. That's all fine. It's just glorious fantasy, really, isn't it?
I mean, yes, it's glorious fantasy. There is also meaning behind all of it. So that, I guess, thinking about Miss Prism's baby in the novel, which is that if one of the thoughts in the play is that you can kind of write your own life, that's one of Oscar Wilde's manifestos, the whole play hinges on the confusion between a baby and an origin story and a 3-volume novel, and the two get mixed up. And so, like, the baby that goes on to lead a life and the novel, which is sort of another life, are interchangeable in some ways. And so fiction and life is muddly. And it's partly that sort of layering of a deeper meaning into it. I don't think the audience is thinking about this particularly, but it gives it a kind of emotional reality or a logic that when it comes up, I think you accept it, because it feels thematically linked to what's been going on, rather than just a totally random thing. And I guess thinking about, I must marry someone called Earnest. I mean, Earnest, of course, means something particular to Wilde. So Earnest is a code word for same-sex love in the period.
Aha. I was going to ask you about the title and the subtitle. There is what we would take as the obvious double meaning of earnest, as in earnest, E-A-R-N-E-S-T, the adjective that means serious, not trifling. It could mean ardent, bracket in desire, according to the OED. But you say it's a particular type of desire. I've also wondered about earnestness as in earnest of whether something's truthful.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, of course, a lot of unserious and untruthful, or really, is it truthful?
Yes.
And of course, he has that classic subtitle, A Trivial Comedy for Serious People, which is a classic epigrammatic inversion, but also means something to him, does it not?
I think so. I mean, Earnest is interesting. So Love in Earnest is the first book of poetry published publicly in the English language about love between men. And it's linked to the word Uranist, which is a code word for a gay man in the 19th century. So from Uranus, the planet, I think. And so I need to marry someone whose name is Earnest is a sort of weirdly multi-layered cake, because it means someone who's got a particular Christian name, so it's a bit random, and so therefore it's satirizing people's obsessions. You know, so in Victorian society, people were obsessed with, I will have this pink ribbon, and I will have a man called Earnest. So that's the first level of satire. But then there's also, I will marry someone who's earnest, who's kind of authentic and sentimental, and that's a sort of satire on the Victorian cult of sentimentality and truth-telling, and we must be frightfully serious in art, and have like Arthur Sullivan's Lost Chord playing on the organ and Tennyson's patriotic Christian poems being read in the background. So that's being satirized.
Yeah.
And then I guess behind that is like, I must marry someone who's queer or gay, I guess, in that there's a sort of, in order to make this potentially queer triangle work, we've got to all be in it together, and we've got to find out each other and marry together. And then so then by the time the whole thing is like wrapped up in a bow at the end, with I've finally discovered the importance of being earnest. I mean, at least in our production, it's played by Hugh Skinner, who stands up on a table and opens his arms in a wonderfully florid gesture. It's meaning really, I think, the importance of being yourself. So I finally discovered the importance of being myself. And in the context of a play that thinks about gayness or queerness, that means the importance of coming out, the importance of being truthful to yourself, and that the story he tells about being called Earnest, which is a kind of brave fiction at the beginning of the play, by the end of the play, he's able to be it in a way. He's written his way into a freer life in which he's able to be himself, in which he is able to be earnest to his own desires.
That's brilliant. You've done most of what we were going to actually address in terms of the meaning of this play. That's fantastic. In your production, there is perhaps more to what may be referred to as the implicit queerness, or in your production, it's more than implicit, isn't it? It opens with Algernon playing the piano dressed in a glorious pink gown.
Yeah.
The whole production is a great celebration of queerness, in a sense. And it's suggested by the fact that these two men are very much leading double lives, aren't they? As Wilde himself, of course, did.
Exactly.
Algernon has this fictitious friend, Bunbury, who he goes off into the country to see and get up to whatever, and Jack pretending to be his bad brother Earnest and coming to town. The flip side of their lives that allows them, as you say, these freedom to be something else other than that society would constrain them to be. So they are leading these double lives, which was essential, of course, that they needed to be discreet. Is Wilde maybe taking some risk in not being as discreet?
Well, I don't know how much risk. I mean, no one in the original production, no one publicly saw it. It doesn't mean that plenty of people didn't privately see it, but no one wrote about anything gay in the show when they saw it. I guess it happens at different levels. So there is a set of references that are very much coded for people in the know. So leaving your cigarette case, for a gentleman to leave one's cigarette case at another man's house is a very clear signal in that period. And Lady Lancing was a code word, and the Duchess of Bolton was a code word. And Earnest, of course, was a code word. And so there were lots of code words through the whole play, which are very explicit to people who knew about them, but and I guess the audience is also at that point, they're slightly trapped in not being able to talk about it, because to talk about it, to admit you know about it, is to sort of implicate yourself in it. And so no one's allowed to talk about it. So that's one of the gambits of the play. But then as you're starting to unpack, the queerness goes deeper than just a bunch of surface references, and it does go into the structure. So as soon as you talk about two men who lead double lives in order to be able to satisfy themselves sexually, then, you know, clearly in the context of Oscar Wilde, him leading a life in high Victorian, supposedly straight society and then going down to the East End to sleep with men is part of what's being thought about. I guess what's difficult in producing the play now is if you play Algy and Jack as gay men who are in a relationship, you bump into two very big obstacles. One, they then, after 10 minutes, say, I'm going to marry Gwendolyn and I'm going to marry Cecily. And I remember that being a problem. I saw a production when I was in my early 20s, and it started off with Algy and Jack in bed together, and they were lovers. And that makes total sense for about 10 minutes. But then they go, isn't it great we're marrying girls? And there was no problem with that. And then the rest of the play didn't make any sense at all, because they were clearly gay men in a relationship and they loved each other. And then A, they went off to marry girls, and then B, they turn out to be brothers in the end. So you're dealing with incest, and that's really not sexy at all.
No.
So there's a sort of difficulty about how far you can push it. But clearly, Oscar Wilde's personal double life is feeding into an understanding of what that double life is.
Yes, it's a great point you make. There are two possible ways to interpret this, I think. One is that marriage could just be a cover.
Yeah.
But there's also, I think, the deeper thing being suggested, which I think you bring out really in your production, which is that there may be an ambiguity to people's sexual identity. And Wilde's making a more serious point about this in suggesting that we can be more than one thing simultaneously. More than one thing can be simultaneously true, such as sexual interests can be fluid. So the men's sexual identity could be fluid in that sense.
Exactly. And so I actually think current understandings of gender are in a weird way easier for us to understand 19th century understandings of gender, because this very binary gay or straight, which was certainly kind of how I was brought up and how I saw the production in the late 90s, which was so difficult because they were gay men and then they were in straight relationships, that a broader and wider and more mainstream understanding of sexual fluidity actually, weirdly, might map onto the 19th century understanding of sex easier than a late 20th century more binary thing.
Absolutely. And as I say, I think this aligns with Wilde's philosophy more generally, that simultaneous things can be true. The trivial can be serious, and throughout what are trivial remarks are actually containing serious points. That our opinions can be inconsistent and contradictory. I think, Algernon are just all over the place with what they believe and say.
Yeah.
That people's identities and behaviors can be both good and bad. So he challenges this notion, I think, of a single fixed reality or laws for life, clearly. I mean, I think Algy says somewhere, the truth is rarely pure and never simple. Modern life would be very tedious if it were either. So I think that's a truism that Wilde feels is important.
Yeah, I think that's the absolute heart of the Wilde philosophy, which is that we don't have an essential immutable self that is ultimately one thing, that we are actually a bunch of surfaces, and that those surfaces are constantly shimmering and changing and not to be packaged up into a completely coherent identity that makes absolute integrated sense in the way that sort of 19th century romantic poets want, like, what's the core of my heart? That's what Wordsworth's trying to really find. And I guess Wilde's suggesting is that there isn't such a thing as a core. All there is what we do and how we behave, and our thoughts are contradictory. And in that sense, that's a very, very modern understanding. In philosophical terms, we'd call that post-structuralist, that there isn't a kind of root or a centre, that the whole thing kind of floats. And that's both fun, because it means that you can change your mind and you can get up to all sorts of stuff and you can have a nice time. I guess it's also freeing, because it means that we don't get put in boxes by our identity, and that our identity is essentially a construct. It's not that, like, being gay or straight, being black or white is a kind of totally immutable thing that was given to us by God, and the meaning of that is imposed and unchangeable. It's actually a thing that has some flexibility within it. It has the possibility for change, it has the possibility for development, it has the possibility for freedom of how we want to understand and interpret that, not to be held by these categories that never change and put in these boxes that don't move.
And all of that is set against social expectation and conventional morality, of course. So there's a challenge throughout to that in the way these men in particular want to live their lives, counter to that.
It kind of shows you that Victorian morality is a bit like the same as manners. So I think one of the most defining moments of the play is when Gwendolen really, really doesn't want sugar in her tea. And Cecily puts an enormous amount of sugar in her tea, and Gwendolen is absolutely horrified because there's sugar in her tea. And it's a kind of deep moral assault. And of course, it's a joke and it's a funny scene, and the point of it is that it's funny. But the object of the satire is that people are taking how much sugar you put in your tea seriously, that it's kind of become this big moral question, and it's absolutely ridiculous. And that the idea that these things change doesn't really matter. I mean, it's just nonsense. It's not an important thing. And so if you take how much sugar you put in your tea seriously, you then come to realize that a lot of ethics, a lot of rules, and a lot of morals are as arbitrary as tea and sugar, or as arbitrary as cake and bread and butter. They're just sort of social constructs. And if they're social constructs, you can choose. It doesn't mean they can't have real damage to people, but that they're not unquestionable. They're not written in stone tablets by God. They're made by humans, and they should be given as much attention as whether we have bread or butter or cake.
Absolutely. I mean, it satirizes a lot of that in terms of social convention. He talked about Jack's house is on the wrong side of Belgrave Square, but that could be changed whether you're wearing your chin high this year or not.
Exactly.
It's all about fashion and how fickle that can be.
Yeah.
Talking about the plot, back to the structure of the plot. I mean, one of the things you'd have to admire hugely about the play, Max, is that it's got the precision of a farce.
Yes.
There's fantastic scenes where, Algernon's plan to impersonate Jack's brother, Earnest, and he visits Cecily in the country just to stir things up. And at that very moment, Jack arrives in mourning for the death of his brother.
Yes.
And you talked about the scenes at the tea table. They have that social satirical element. There's two consecutive scenes like that, where first the two women have this argument heatedly while observing the etiquette of taking tea, as you said, and then the two men do the same, and both behave in a completely childish way, squabbling over the cake and muffins. And the point is the childishness of all of those things. But also, going back to your point about the queerness built into the structure, why do they marry? Algy says he's going to declare Bunbury dead, and Jack the same. He's going to declare Earnest dead. Is that they have to somehow deny that side of themselves to enter into the heterosexual relationships of marriage. And yet they don't have to in the end. As you said earlier, they never pay the price. I think you get a sense that they don't have to change. And your production in particular would suggest that actually they're all just going to carry on in some way or other.
Well, exactly. So at the very end, Gwendolen says, I never changed except in my affections. And then Cecily says, what a noble nature you have.
Yes.
And the guys have a similar conversation. And so at the very end, even as they're leaping into same-sex couples, they both talk about other partners or different partners. And so in the text, at the very least, they're talking about it being an open relationships at the end of the play. I mean, whether that openness includes same-sex relationships is not something the text discusses, but that's what we're trying to imply lightly in our production.
Yeah, well, in the text, Gwendolen says somewhere very early on that she intends to develop in many directions, and I thought that was quite nice. And then she says, I may marry someone else and marry often.
Exactly.
So you really get this sense of sexual impulse, that the currents are not running very far below the surface with the women as well. They have independent desires. I mean, Gwendolen talks about the vibrations she feels, which is played up in your production, as well as the suggestion of the potential relationships or interests between the two women.
Yes. I mean, I think if truth be told, the potential sexual attraction between the two women is potentially latent in the text, but I think probably isn't in Oscar's original text. But I think the frisson between the men and them flirting or them uncertainly understanding a bunch of queer jokes between them is definitely in the text. I guess in my head, it was a better story. So if two gay men marry two straight women, that's a tragedy, especially if it's not discussed. Of course, that happened a lot in the 19th century. That was called lavender marriages and was a thing. And there's a very beautiful book by Tom Crew recently called The New Life about the two men who wrote the first book on homosexuality in the English language, or the first published book, which was really helpful in thinking about this play. I recommend it, The New Life by Tom Crew. That's a story of pain and suffering and not being able to be yourself. And of course, one of the brilliant things about If Once Being Earnest is that it's almost an entirely pain-free play. There's almost no trauma and there's very little backstory and there's very little interior suffering going on. And so the story of two gay men marrying two straight women is hard because it's a tragedy and there's no place for that pain in the play. So I guess the story we're trying to tell is of four queer or bisexual young people who understand that about each other and that they marry in order to be able to have the freedoms that they want within their marriages in a Victorian society.
Absolutely right. And it's a step beyond the conventional romantic conclusion, which we could all accept at face value,
yes,
and has been for 100 or more years. But there are too many clues to suggest that it is hard to imagine that the amorous adventures of all these characters are over.
Well, I think it's really clear that they're not. That both the men and the women say it's not the end of the play. It's not like, here we are in heteronormative monogamy.
Yes. And then, as you say, no, there's no pain. It's not a morality tale either, where any of these people pay a price for their deceptions. It all turns out fine.
Everyone wins, even Lady Bracknell, who is in a sense the antagonist of these four young people. She gets what she wants. They all get married to rich people. The money stays in the right hands. You know, it's all okay.
Yeah. Well, now that you mention, it's amazing that we've been talking for quite a while and have barely mentioned perhaps the most famous character in the play, Lady Bracknell. At least famous for the role she offers the actor, particularly challenged at delivering afresh, of course, the infamous line, a handbag, which I read described as the to be or not to be of theatrical comedy. So I don't know how you felt about that challenge.
I think it's a very hard challenge because it's 3 syllables. So there's not a huge amount that happens. I think Sharon's approach, which is brilliant, she's an extraordinary actor, and her approach is just to play the moment truthfully and not to try and like a particular thing about it. I think the expectation becomes a burden. And if you look at that old film of Edith Evans saying a handbag, she actually doesn't do anything particularly special with it anyway. She just says it quite nicely, quite truthfully, and I think that is probably the best approach. But no, Sharon's brilliant reimagining of Lady Bracknell in a way that's both totally new, but also a person we sort of know as well, and the truthfulness of that is really wonderful, I think. And she's got a great facility with the language, and Wilde gives her these really, really difficult, long 4-line sentences that end in a joke. And Sharon sails through them with such style and class. And they sound so wonderful in that accent. They sound fresh and period at the same time in a way that's really glorious.
It is. And actually, also, of course, there's an important characterization of Lady Bracknell as a focus, I suppose, in part of Wilde's social satire, because there's a backstory hinted at, isn't there, to Lady Bracknell? Tell us a bit about what that is about.
Well, the backstory of Lady Bracknell is that she was born without very much money and that she married into it, and that she's sort of paranoid in a way, and that she's worried that she might lose class. And so I guess she too has a kind of surface. She's not like born to the manor. She's someone who's worked her way up or married her way into that world, like Oscar Wilde did himself, and therefore is both brilliantly of that world, but also an outsider, and has sort of further to lose if it goes wrong.
Yes, and is, I guess, preoccupied by the financials, for example. She says that she had no fortune of any kind when she married Lord Bracknell.
Exactly.
So her origins are not what she now appears. And in fact, in the 2002 film starring Judi Dench, there's a flashback suggesting that she was, in fact, a music hall dancer when she met Lord Bracknell.
Right, yes.
So you can imagine that whole backstory like that. So she has married up. And of course, there is, through her, much satire on marriage and marrying for social and financial advantage.
Yes, exactly.
Which she did.
Yes.
And I guess it was the custom. You know, Lady Bracknell says to Gwendolen that when you do become engaged to someone, I or your father will inform you of the fact. And she's already compiled a list of candidates. And of course, Jack's credentials by birth are not satisfactory until they are, as it turns out. And it is all about the money, so that when Algernon declares an interest in marrying Cecily, Lady Bracknell disapproves until she discovers that Cecily is very rich.
Yes, and this play is a matriarchy. The most powerful person on stage is a woman, which is great. And that in both the proposal scenes between the younger characters, it's the women leading as well. So women are running the show. And so that's also part of Oscar Wilde's pushback against Victorian society, I think, is that it's a story in which the women are in charge, really.
I was going to mention that, actually, that the women, there's very much a sense that they will easily be the match for the men in these marriages, if not more.
Yes.
As you say, Gwendolen directs the marriage proposal, and we talked about her developing in her own directions, and Cecily has the whole thing mapped out in her diary. So, yeah, there's no doubt that they will continue in that form, I think.
Yeah.
There's also stuff about money as well. We talked about marriage, but there's hints in the play about the costs that are borne by these men in particular in living the lifestyle they do.
Yes.
The hint that, they may be living beyond their means. And there was a note in the program, Max, where you talked about there being a fourth act. Originally, there was some extra scenes that Wilde wrote that were cut in the original production.
That's right.
What is that all about?
So Wilde kind of lied about the writing of the play. So he said he'd written it in an idle afternoon, but actually he'd laboured over it for several months, doing 9 or 10 really polished and detailed drafts of it. But the draft that was about to go into rehearsal with George Alexander, the director, was a 4-act play. And George Alexander had been to see a half-hour curtain raiser on Broadway that he wanted to do. So he told Wilde, I want to do a half-hour warm-up before the importance of being earnest. I guess in the way you might watch a short film now before a feature.
So he needed it to be shorter.
He needed it to be shorter, so we told Wilde to cut half an hour out of it. And so Wilde compressed it from 4 acts, which is a traditional 19th century comedy structure, into 3. The truth is that Wilde was an excellent editor of his own work, and so it's better for the cuts. And although there were some good jokes that are lost, there's only really one big extra scene in which Algy's got a debt collector coming. And it's sort of weirdly a satire on his extravagance and also the threat of police coming to get someone who's bumbling. But it's a sort of little incident that wraps itself up a bit too neatly. And one of the things that Wilde actually did is he took a lot of the real world references out as he edited it to make it even more of a hot air balloon detached from the real world. So his editing was excellent. So we've basically kept his editing, but restored the 4-act structure so that we get the interval in the middle of the show.
Okay, great. So you haven't put back in this scene with
Mr. Grimsby, he's called.
Yes, this lawyer arrives in the country pursuing a debt that apparently Ernest Worthing has been racking up at the Savoy Hotel. Again, with hindsight, it might be something foreshadowing of being arrested and taken off to prison, which the lawyer threatens Ernest, who is actually Algernon at this point.
Yeah.
Again, more confusion about who's who. But now, Wilde himself described the play as a delicate bubble of fancy. But he added, and this is something I guess we've been touching on, it has its philosophy. What do you think that philosophy is?
Well, yes, he then also, when he was putting the plays together for publication, even more than that, the publisher said, it's like a wonderful souffle, isn't it? And Wilde said, yes, but I'd almost rather it was like a pistol shot. So he went one step further. What is the pistol shot? What is its philosophy? Well, I suppose it starts off with the philosophy of taking serious things trivially and trivial things seriously. But if you unpack that, I guess what that really means is that manners and mores and social customs are essentially trivial in some ways, and that things that box us in and things that lock us into restrictive ways of understanding the world and ourselves are constructed. They're not given to us as absolutes by God. They're something that society invents. And so that's a kind of philosophy of freedom, I think.
And the converse of that is that what should be taken seriously are things that people don't necessarily, which is art and beauty and style, he would propose. Is that not right?
Yes, I think so.
And that's very much on display, I think, in Algernon's performance, the way he lives his life, his self-consciously flamboyant behavior. And it's almost performative in a sense. And I thought there was a bit of a suggestion, particularly in your production, I guess, where he embraces this kind of performative quality. And it's a bit like Wilde himself lived, of course. He embraced being a celebrity. And it resonated, I thought, with our own time in social media, for example, where we create these public identities. And Wilde very consciously did this.
Totally. I think just as Wilde put on the Oscar Wilde show, Algae, brilliantly performed by Shruti Gatwal, puts on the Algae show. And that is a kind of performance of self that is mercurial and constantly changing and witty, and very hard to know what the true centre is, because maybe there isn't one. Maybe, like Wilde's suggesting, everyone is just what they're doing in that particular moment and constantly able to change and transform, which I think is very freeing. And that's why it's such a good play rather than anything else, because identity is essentially theatrical. Identity is essentially a thing we perform rather than a thing we have deep, deep in our core.
Yes. As it happens, I just saw The Invention of Love, Stoppart's play, last week.
Yes.
Where Wilde is, in fact, a character. And there's a line attributed to him where it's reported in the press that he's paraded down Piccadilly in London carrying a lily. And he says, it's not whether I did it or not that's important, but whether people believed I did it.
Mm-hmm.
Which, again, he was determined to be famous. And a great line that jumped out at me, that Cecily is recording in her diary and says it's simply a very young girl's record of her own thoughts and impressions and consequently meant for publication.
Yes.
That sounded so today, doesn't it?
Well, exactly. They're all live streaming their lives on Insta, I think is the modern equivalent of it. Yes.
Exactly. But then some serious points about the aesthetic life, as in the aesthetes, that Wilde set out principles about art, talking about art for art's sake, as opposed to the mainstream Victorian view that literature and art should have an ethical purpose, for example, which I think you've touched on. So the play is a statement of these principles. As we said, life imitates art. As style, not sincerity, is essential, Gwendolen says. So the sincerity, I think, as you describe it, is this earnestness of the mores of the time, of social constructs.
Yes, I think I agree with all that. I just want to try and say it in a slightly more complicated way, which is that art for art's sake is an ethical project. So I suppose if Wilde's saying that the Victorian melodrama that deals with social issues like the fallen woman is actually not the best way to deal with social issues, and that the way to get a little more freedom within society, or a way in which to create equality and justice, I mean, this is his idea rather than necessarily the right way, it's actually art, the beauty itself will help do that, and that will help liberate us. And so that within art for art's sake, there is an ethical project, and that the more worthy, let us champion social causes, kind of campaigning art that isn't interested in beauty might not actually be the best way of creating the society he dreams of seeing.
Beauty will liberate us. As you said, it will be better. He believed that these were the ideas that could define the way to live, that Algernon lives by. We should live as beautifully and dramatically as we can, because all the rest is just social masks or not truth. Back to what is true and what isn't true.
Yeah.
I read a wonderful quote from Yeats, who said about Wilde that he lived in the enjoyment of his own spontaneity, which aligns with what you've been saying about how it's nothing fixed, and sought the fresh impulse of joy. That sounds like a wonderful way to live. The fresh impulse of joy?
Yes, I mean, I guess that is what our amazing actors are trying to do every night. And I think they're really successful. When it really comes to life is when they feel the fresh impulse of joy.
Yes, absolutely. And when they had that ad lib, as I touched on earlier, it was totally joyous. They were living that.
Yes.
But as you also touched on, in all sorts of ways, the play is subversive. There's a moment when Jack says to Algernon that he always seems to want to argue about things, to which he replies, that is exactly what things were originally made for. And this seems to be what he's doing a lot of the time. Algernon is questioning, challenging everything, even if it's disguised in these perfectly phrased epigrams. And I wanted to talk to you just briefly about the language in the play, because we can't miss talking about how clever it is and how joyous that is. Some of the most quotable lines in drama, of course, like all women become like their mothers, that is their tragedy, no man does, that's his. And Algy himself says, that's perfectly phrased, which of course it is. But it's not just that, is it? The form in which Algernon and Wilde challenge social orthodoxy is this epigram, which are always constructed in dual constructions.
Yes.
Inverting the familiar to mean the opposite. So we have, for example, divorces are made in heaven, as opposed to marriages. So the meanings are always inverted, but sometimes you get carried away, and I wonder whether, the perfect symmetry of the phrase or the thrill of its subversion is intoxicating, but sometimes I wonder, does it really make sense? Is it true or not? It goes past you almost and thinking, oh, well, that's great. That's so clever. That's beautiful. Does it really mean anything, or is he just being clever?
I think that's always been the great debate with Wilde. Is it just inverting words to make it sound clever and it doesn't really mean anything? Or in the inversion of it, are you somehow being asked to think about these two categories? In matters of great importance, style, not sincerity, is the greatest thing. And then I guess you start thinking about, well, either it's just sort of nonsense and it's like, haha, that's witty because it's an inversion. Or you start thinking about style and sincerity and you go, well, are they different? Are they opposing? Can you change them round? Which matters more? If you can flip something on its head, does that mean that it's sort of, I don't know, it can get your brain thinking about what these different categories are and are they really opposed in the way you think they are?
That's a great point, because there was another line where he's saying lying, the telling of beautiful, untrue things, is the proper aim of art. Is it? Really? Untrue things is the aim of art? Well, as you say, it's just a challenge. Think about it. And as you said, I mean, Jack often says to Algy, oh, that's nonsense. Oh, that's nonsense. You're always talking nonsense.
The line after talking nonsense is really important. So Jack says, you never talk anything but nonsense. And Algy says, nobody ever does. So in a way, one of the projects of Wilde is to show that all this moralizing talk is nonsense. And so that if it's true one way round, like marriages are made in heaven, well, then you could also just say it the other way around, divorces are made in heaven. And so sort of both are true. And so in a way, all this social judgy talk, because you may as well just say the opposite and it's sort of funny and true too, it's all nonsense in a way.
Both are true and both are untrue.
Both are true and both are untrue. And that's what I mean by you get to it being towards Beckett in a way, because the moral certainty of Victorian England is suddenly stripped away and it's all nonsense. And of course, it's a joyful version of it rather than a kind of Beckett post-apocalyptic version of it. But that's in a way what's happening. It's like it shows if you can say the moral line both way round, then in a way it's all nonsense. And if it's all nonsense, we can tell the story of our lives in the way we want and sort of be free from it because we're liberated from all this judgment as just being language nonsense that we can play with. It becomes a game rather than something that constricts us.
It is seductive, the idea of the freedom and the joy. And who would have thought we would get from this to Beckett? But there is no question that there's just a celebration of life that you get from this play.
Yes.
And it's challenge to any constraint on living so vitally, as he says, the vital importance of being earnest. I wanted to ask you about the ending, actually, that's last line. I guess you touched on it earlier about the different meanings of the word earnest in this context. Do you think there's some irony in this final statement? Because they aren't really, none of these characters are really going to live an earnest life as we described.
No. So earnest in one sense is Victorian sentimentality, and that's a satire. It's the satire of being good and heterosexual and monogamous and going to church on a Sunday and that kind of rather earnest Victorian oratorio music, all that kind of Elgar and Mendelssohn sort of stuff that's very felt. So in a way, the surface line is finally I've become a good, proper Victorian man and I'm going to settle down and go to church. So that's like one layer of it. But of course, because it's Wilde, it's got another layer, which is like, I've also discovered the importance of being gay and being out and being fabulous and being true to myself. And that the fiction I told about my double life has actually come true. And I've now achieved liberation. And the fact that both can be true at once seems very freeing, I think.
Absolutely. Yes, Wilde is not a champion of an earnest life. That sense of freedom is uplifting. The whole play seems to be a statement of the promotion of an alternative life to that prescribed by convention.
But then a serious Bunburyist, one has a right to Bunbury anywhere one likes, in a way that always sounds to me campaigning when Shooty says that. I sort of find it almost rather moving. And that in a way, I think because the double meaning of the ending is simultaneous, in coming out, he is also being Victorian and sentimental and truthful. So all the things, it's not like they're opposites. So weirdly, if you live an authentic life as a queer person, then you are being earnest and truthful to yourself in a way. And so that we're no longer torn between the Victorian church-going heterosexual world and your secret life. You can be yourself in public. And that's a different sort of earnestness. That's a public truth that the play is shooting at, I think.
Yes, and in fact, structurally, as you say, that goes back to the point originally that Jack was disguising this earnestness and now is able to say.
Exactly.
Declaring that truth.
Yeah.
Okay, well, yes, we went some places I didn't expect there with Beckett, etc., but it was fabulous. Thank you, Max. Before I let you go, One of the traditions of the podcast, I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might cover in the podcast, or really one that's just a personal favorite. Is there something you might recommend to listeners? Or maybe it's something you're going to do next.
Well, weirdly, I want to go back. So this year I did The Real Thing by Tom Stoppard. And I think one of the things I learned from doing the two plays back to back is how much Tom studied Oscar Wilde. And there was a construction of sentence and epigram and wit and inversion and structural dexterity and surface glitter with kind of deep emotional undercurrents that Stoppard gets from Oscar Wilde's writing. So I think it would be exciting to read Arcadia or Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead or The Real Thing in the light of going to see a production of Importance of Being Earnest and see how carefully Stoppard has read and learned from Oscar Wilde.
That's a brilliant suggestion. Thank you. It's strange, actually, that's come together because I mentioned The Invention of Love.
Yes.
And Stoppard, of course, did a lot of research into that period. It's A.E. Housman, but also Wilde features as a character. And central to all of that is the identity of a gay man in that time.
Yes.
And we have that writ large here in Importance of Being Earnest as well. So thank you for that. A great recommendation. Stoppard, one of our favorites. And as I said, we did The Real Thing very recently, inspired by your production. So thank you for that. Max's fabulous production of The Importance of Being Earnest continues at the National Theatre until the 25th of January. It is a complete joy, so try to go. Thank you, Max, for joining me. It's great meeting you. Thanks for the production. Congratulations on it. As the curtain falls, we are left with the joy of Wilde's artifice. His effortlessly clever plotting, his flawless wit and glittering aesthetic, which in itself is designed to celebrate beauty and art. But we can also be easily dazzled by the cleverness and the comedy, that we don't notice how in every detail of his construction and language he is saying true and serious things. It is a comedy for serious people. I also can't help being struck by the extraordinary contrast between the dazzling energy and beauty that he conjures in his theatrical world and the reality of what happened to him in the real world. Thankfully, the play survives as a beacon of beauty and free expression. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.